Let's be honest, this entire recall election was nothing more than a case of sour grapes from the radical left that has taken over what used to be the once proud Democratic Party here in the United States of America. Let's remember what happened here. The hardcore left launched this recall election because Scott Walker actually had the audacity to act in the best interest of the people of Wisconsin. Let's remember what happened. He inherited a fiscal mess, over a $3 billion shortfall, thanks to the actions of his Democratic predecessor. So what did he do? He fixed that problem. He balanced that budget without raising taxes. He balanced that budget by cutting spending. And now, because of his actions, Wisconsin's actually adding jobs for the first time in a long time. Their unemployment rate lower than it's been since 2008. But let's also remember why the radical left called this recall election in the first place. Let's remember, here's the frightening policy that Governor Walker instituted. This is what caused all the fuss. Now get ready for it. Now, be prepared. This is pretty scary stuff. This is what's caused this nonstop campaigning for the last couple of years. In order to eliminate the budget deficit that he inherited, to avoid having to lay off teachers and others, Governor Walker asked the public employee union members that he asked them to pay a small portion of their own retirement plans and to pay a small portion towards their own health care coverage. Just like folks in the private sector already do every day, including the taxpayers in Wisconsin that are paying those bills. That's it. That's what prompted the Democratic legislators to flee the state, to come hide here in Chicago. That's what prompted them to put Wisconsin through the Civil War, which, by the way, cost their taxpayers over $18 million. And here's the amazing thing. If you watch the TV ads, you listen to the radio ads, you went online, here's the amazing thing. They collected all those signatures, spent all those tens of millions of dollars special interest money, flooded the state with liberal activists and union activists. And here's the amazing thing. The Democratic candidate, Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett, he didn't even campaign on the issue of collective bargaining. Didn't even run TV ads on it, didn't run radio ads on it, didn't talk about it for the entire last month of the campaign. The whole reason for the recall, the whole reason they said they needed another election was actually absent from the actual recall election. Now, why is that? It's pretty simple. The people of Wisconsin agree with Scott Walker. They agree with his reforms. Here's the truth. His conservative reforms are reasonable, they're sound policy, they're fair, and most importantly, they're actually working in the state of Wisconsin. That's the entire story about the recall election, but I've got one important question before I leave the topic of Wisconsin. Where was President Obama? You know, on Tuesday night, I was asked, on election night, I was asked to go and do an interview on Fox News to talk about the election. They had me scheduled for about an hour after the polls would close. So, of course, I thought this would be I'd be in an unenviable position. You have to be there on TV talking about an election before you have all the results, before you know what's going to happen. Well, as you know, they called the election 49 minutes after the polls closed. The experts said it was going to be a long night for folks in Wisconsin. Turns out it was a long night for the folks right here in Chicago and the Obama headquarters. That's where the long night was. You know what was amazing? Did you hear their spin afterwards? It was almost predictable. Immediately, the White House declared, oh, that Wisconsin recall election, that really didn't matter. They actually said it Tuesday before the polls closed. See, apparently, I didn't get the secret code. Apparently, when Democrats win elections, it's a really big deal. But when Republicans win an election, then it doesn't matter. But here's the head scratcher. Where was the president during this recall election? Why didn't he come to Wisconsin to save the day? Wasn't this an important election? Remember, President Obama won Wisconsin by 14 percentage points 4 years ago. Surely he's got enough political capital to use some of it for the cause. There are many reasons maybe he didn't want to come to Wisconsin. Did he not go to Wisconsin because he thought maybe he wouldn't be an asset? Maybe he saw his own poll numbers and thought he'd be a drag on Mayor Barrett's campaign? Did he not go to Wisconsin because he knew a majority of those voters actually supported the governor's reforms? Did he not go to Wisconsin because he was afraid of hurting himself by backing a loser? Yeah, all of the above. That's exactly right. But you know, there's an important lesson about leadership here. And before I turn my attention to the national issues, I want to contrast Scott Walker versus President Obama. Scott was faced with some tough choices. He didn't shrink for them. He stood tall, he took decisive action, and thanks to him, Wisconsin's better off for his actions. He wasn't lacking in courage. The president, however, that's a different matter. He shrunk from this challenge. He elected to stay away from Wisconsin for fear of losing. It's not what leaders do. Can you imagine the message to other Democrats willing to stake their ground for the president? He's not going to come to your state. He might send a tweet out for you the night before, but that's about all he's going to do. I think the president would have done well to show some real courage to engage in that fight, and he didn't. There's a lesson in leadership here. Leaders don't run from a fight. The bottom line takeaway from the Cheesehead Rebellion is this: conservative reform ideas work in the real world. We found that to be the case in Wisconsin, we found that to be in Louisiana, and they'll work in Washington, D.C. if we have the courage to try them there as well. Now, the next thing we need to do is to elect Governor Romney, get about the business of rebuilding America and ending this left-wing experiment that is called the Obama administration in Washington, D.C. You know, I've said and others have said that the election in Wisconsin was the second most important election this entire year in the entire country, and I believe that. But I also believe this upcoming presidential election is the most important election of our lifetimes. Now, why is that? Let's be honest what's at stake in this election. President Obama cannot run on his record. He cannot ask the American people, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Quite simply, this president has not kept his promises. Remember, he promised that he would cut the deficit in half by the end of his first term. Not going to happen. Promised that if we enacted his $800 billion stimulus plan, unemployment would be below 8%. It's been above 8% for 40 months, and the record is still going. So that's not going to happen. Promised that he would come up with a plan to reform the entitlement programs. That's not going to happen. Promised that he was going to change the tone and unify Washington, D.C., bringing the parties together. Well, they did unanimously vote to reject his budget, but I don't think that's what he meant when he talked about bringing the parties together. He promised if we passed Obamacare, our premiums would go down $2,500. CBO says that's not going to happen. Healthcare premiums are going up, not down. So he can't focus on his record. All he can do is savagely attack Governor Romney and the Republican Party. But let's not be distracted by all these attacks. Let's be honest and focus on what's really at stake in this election. There are two different visions for America. The president's vision, I call it the Occupy Wall Street vision. And let's be honest about it. Let's describe what this vision is about: managing the slow decline of America. This vision is about class warfare. It's about dividing us. It's about demonizing those that have been successful in America. It is about growing the federal government to 24% of the GDP, borrowing over $1 trillion a year, accumulating $15 trillion of debt. It's about becoming more and more like Europe. And if you want to see where that path takes us, look and see what's happening in Greece. Look and see what's happening in other countries that are on the verge of bankruptcy as they can no longer afford their central governments. There's a different vision for America. The vision that we're offering that says, in America, what makes the American dream so great is not that you're guaranteed equal results, but rather you're guaranteed equal opportunity. Our vision says, you know, you're not entitled to your neighbor's property. You have no right to your neighbor's car, his home, or his property. What you are entitled to in America is the opportunity to work hard, get a great education, do even better than your parents. The American dream says that, and the miracle of America, part of what makes us such an amazing country, the greatest country in the history of the world, is that your last name, the circumstances of your birth, your zip code, your geography, your race, your gender, they don't determine your outcome as an adult in this great country. That's what makes America so great. And I truly believe that's what's at stake in this election. Every generation of Americans has left behind more opportunities for our children than we've inherited from our parents. None of us wants to become the first generation that mortgages our children's future because we borrowed so much in their names. We have spent so much on our government, they no longer have the opportunities we inherited from our parents. That's what makes this election so important. My little girl brought a button home the other day from school. It says, "Nobody tell the president what comes after $1 trillion." We can't afford another 4 more years of this administration. I'll give you an example of the kinds of policies we're implementing in Louisiana to preserve that American dream for our children. Essential to that American dream is making sure that every child in Louisiana, every child in America gets a great education. In today's economy, we have to be competitive in the global economy. If you're 55 years old, America ranked #1 when you were getting your education in international education. For our 20-year-olds, we rank somewhere between 14th and 16th in the entire world. It's not for lack of money. We have doubled the amount of money we spend per student since 1970 controlling for inflation. Only Luxembourg spends more than us per student. So it's not for lack of money. Simply throwing more money at the same old programs doesn't change anything. So we've tried to do 2 things in Louisiana. We've made progress in Louisiana, but a third of our kids are below grade level. We spend $1 billion a year of state taxpayer dollars on failing school. 44% of our public schools are failing. We can't wait for incremental reform. Our kids only grow up once. We passed 4 of the most consequential educational bills in the history of our state this last session. I want to talk about 2 of them. Number 1, we said we want to put a great teacher in every classroom. Every study shows having a great teacher in the classroom is the most important thing you can do to improve education for your children. Every one of us here remembers that great teacher that motivated us, that took an interest in us, that helped us to be who we are today. Yet when you look at our policies, you look at our tenure and our payment policies, we do everything we can to stifle great teachers. Now think about it. Who could run a business if we came to your business and said, you can't pay your teachers, you can't pay your employees based on performance? You have to pay them based on how long they've been there. How many of you could run a business if we came to you and said, and by the way, we're going to make it virtually impossible for you to fire those employees that aren't doing a good job? So in Louisiana, we passed the largest tenure overhaul bill in our state's history saying, if you're an ineffective teacher after a year, you lose tenure. If you're ineffective after 3 years, you lose your certificate. You've got to be in the top 10% for 5 years before we'll even give you tenure. And we're no longer making payment, hiring, or firing decisions based on how long you've been breathing. Instead, we're going to do it based on student achievement. Teacher unions came out and said, Governor, we're okay evaluating teachers, just don't tie it to student achievement. They said, don't tie it so closely to student achievement. We object to the fact you're tying it so closely to how well students are doing. That's ridiculous. And that shows you what's wrong with educational reform in this country. Education reform needs to be about the students, not the adults in the classroom. Second thing we did was we passed a bill giving more choice to more students than has ever been done before. We have said the dollar should follow the child instead of making the child follow the dollars. Parents know what's best for their children. And so if that child would learn better in a private school, a charter school, a parochial school, an online school, a traditional public school, a dual enrollment program, a technical college, whatever makes sense for that child, the dollar should follow that child. So over 380,000 students in Louisiana are now eligible to take the dollars we would otherwise spend on them and go to the school of their parents' choice. Teacher unions didn't like that one either. Teacher union leader came out and said this, said parents don't have, and I'm quoting, parents don't have a clue when it comes to making educational choices for their children. I met with a group of moms the very next day. They said, Governor, we make choices for our children every day. We know our children's needs better than the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. or Baton Rouge, and that is absolutely the best summary of this debate. That elitist, arrogant mentality from those unions is what has been stifling public education for too long in this country. I believe parents, not bureaucrats, know what's best for their children. And we're showing that it works. Pre-Katrina, New Orleans had the worst public school system in the country 5 years ago. When you look at where we were 5 years ago to today, 80% of the kids in New Orleans are now in charter schools. The percentage of kids doing reading and math on grade level has doubled. We've got more work to do, but we're showing that choice and competition actually work in New Orleans. But just like in Wisconsin, the unions aren't giving up. Indeed, just yesterday, they filed a lawsuit to try to stop our reforms. And indeed, they've launched a recall initiative against the Speaker of our House and others who are involved in passing these reforms. But I've got a message to those teacher unions as well. We're not giving up either. We're going to continue to fight to make sure that every child gets a great education and can pursue that American dream right here without having to leave this great state of Louisiana. Now, I think it's been pretty clear, if you've been listening to me today, if you've heard from me before, it's pretty clear that I'm not a fan of the Obama administration. I think it's pretty clear I didn't vote for the president the first time. I'm not voting for him again. But let me take a moment to be clear why this is. The Obama administration is actually the nexus of liberalism and incompetence together, and that's a deadly combination. I think the liberalism part is pretty widely understood. Look, he ran a clever campaign in 2008, presented himself as a moderate, a centrist, as competent. But the reality is he is governed as the most liberal president since Jimmy Carter was president of the United States. Let's look at his record. Jammed through a government takeover of our health care that never had the support of a majority of the American people, not even on its best day. It's bad policy, it's unpopular, he jammed it through anyway. It cost the Democrats control of the House, it cost Nancy Pelosi the Speaker's position, thank God. But President Obama considers that a small price to pay. This administration lurches America every day towards a model of a socialist government that is patterned after European-style socialist policies. Here's the real problem. I suspect that many in the Obama administration really don't believe in private enterprise. At best, they see business as something to be endured so that it can provide tax money for government programs. He is so separated from reality. Today, you may have seen his comments. Said the private sector was doing quite well. Mr. President, I've got a message for you. The private sector is not doing well when 23 million Americans are unemployed and underemployed in this great country. This president, the private sector is so foreign to him, he might need a passport to actually go visit the private sector. He might need a translator to help him talk to folks in the private sector. You know, we scoff at the notion of redistribution of wealth. We think of it as a nutty, a discredited socialist notion. That's not the way they see it. They see redistribution of wealth as simply a pejorative term for exactly what they believe in. Now, they won't call it a redistribution of wealth. They'll call it, quote, taking care of people. They'll call it being progressive. They call it government. Now, while the liberalism of the Obama administration is widely understood, the incompetence of it remains, as of yet, an untold story. You may have seen a few weeks ago I was on TV, and I made the comment again that prior to being president, President Obama had never run anything. In fact, he hadn't even run a lemonade stand. That was the example I used on national TV. That's a fun line. Folks were entertained by it, thought it was a good joke. But here's the problem. It's not a joke. It's the truth. We put a guy in the White House who has no experience running anything. In some sense, the joke's actually on us. But it's not a joke. We can't afford another 4 years of on-the-job training. There may have been times in our country's history when having an untested leader in the White House would have been fine. But, you know, this is not one of those times. I had the unique opportunity to work closely with the president during the BP oil spill and its aftermath in the Gulf. And there were a couple of things we learned from that experience. Number one, I don't know if you knew this, the president's energy secretary, he's got a Nobel Prize. I know because I heard this almost every 2 minutes coming out of the press. It was almost like he used that title so often, I almost thought that was the guy's name. My Nobel Prize winning, I don't know what that had to do with the oil spill, but every other word, it was my Nobel Prize winning energy secretary. It became very apparent the president didn't trust the average American people, but rather relied on these so-called experts. And so as that oil got closer and closer to our coast, we kept wondering why the government wouldn't allow us to do more to protect ourselves. We began to learn, a local said this, when they tell you that help is coming tomorrow, that doesn't mean help is coming tomorrow. That just means help is not coming today. That's all that means when they say help is coming tomorrow. But it was so frustrating to see that oil come closer and closer to our coast, and to hear the president continue to rely on these experts. He refused to meet with the fishermen, refused to go see the oil for himself. Finally, one day, there was a local fisherman who got so frustrated by this. He was meeting with me. He said, Governor, I don't understand it. This oil is coming closer to our coast. It's going to eat our wetlands, eat away at our estuaries, destroy our livelihood, our way of life. He said, I don't understand why we're just waiting for it. He said, why don't we go out there and vacuum that oil up before it gets to us? I said, that's a great idea. Called up the White House and said, why don't we go vacuum that oil up before it gets to our coast? They acted like I was an idiot. They said, Governor, you know that oil's out in the middle of the water. How are you going to get a vacuum truck out there? There are no roads down there. Now, look, to be fair, I don't have a Nobel Prize like the president and his energy secretary. I said, look, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but why don't we put a truck on the back of a boat and go get that oil? And I hate this answer from the federal government. They said, no, we can't do that. We've never done that before, so we can't try that. So, well, they've never spilled this much oil before. Why not try something different? But they refused to do it. So I ordered the National Guard to build 2 prototypes to show them this could be done. Now, we've got the finest men and women in our Louisiana National Guard. They've been to Iraq, they've been to Afghanistan, they've been to Haiti. But here's the problem. We don't have a Navy. So we really don't have a whole lot of ships just sitting around waiting for this kind of thing. So the first 2 prototypes, I'll admit, looked a little funny. I mean, the first one was literally a truck strapped onto the back of a barge. This thing didn't look like it was going to float. National reporter came down to cover the first sailing. He looked at it, looked at me, and said, Governor, aren't those the same trucks you used to clean out your porta potties on Friday night after the football games? I said, please don't put that in your newspaper. I mean, it's true, but people all over the country will think we're crazy. I mean, you got a porta potty truck strapped on the back of a barge. Thing looks like it's going to sink. You got a guy back there with a hose picking up oil out of the water. And you know what? It worked. They picked up thousands of gallons of oil, and a week later, I love this about the private sector, they called me up and said, Governor, they saw this on TV. They said, please stop using trucks. We got industrial pumps, and don't use those barges. We got industrial boats. We can do this right. They had dozens of these working, picking up thousands of gallons of oil out of that water before it got to our coast. And then I got the phone call. A week later, the White House called us up and said, we're shutting down your barges. We've actually already shut them down. Ordered them back into port. I said, why? This is the first thing that's working. They said, we haven't done our inspections yet. So what do you need to inspect? They said, we need to check the valves. Because if you don't use the right valves, there's a chance you might drop some oil back into the water. I said, we're picking up thousands of gallons of oil, and you're worried about drops? They said, those are the rules. I said, that's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. I said, you've got 24 hours before we order them back into the water. I said, why can't you inspect them while they're doing their work? They said, nope, those are the rules. National media heard about this. I guess they realized how absurd it was because later, several hours later, they called back and said, all right, never mind, we're not going to check the valves, but they still have to stay in the port because now we need to do our inspections to count the number of life jackets and fire extinguishers on those boats. I said, why can't you do that while they're doing their work instead of stopping them? And again, they said, those are the rules. Almost 24 hours later, I was on my way to the port to see those boats for myself, and I got the call saying, I guess they realized how absurd this all had become. And they said, never mind, we canceled our inspections. The barges can go back to work. We don't need to count the life jackets anymore. But here's what we learned. You think not only of that time they had wasted, while we could have been out there fighting that oil, you see what happens when you've got the most liberal, the most incompetent president since Jimmy Carter in the White House. That's what happens when you've got President Obama in the White House. So as I close, I'm going to leave you one simple concept. Yes, the president needs to go because his liberal policies are wrong and bad for America. But it's worse than that. It's basic incompetence. We can't afford another 4 more years of on-the-job training. You know, you listen to politicians long enough, they'll tell you this is the most important election in our lifetimes. They'll tell you that we've got to get out and vote. At some point, they sound like the boy who keeps crying wolf, who keeps saying the sky is falling. A wolf is coming near, the end is near, we've got to do something. This time, it's true. Maybe it's been said so many times that people don't believe it. But the truth is that America is that proverbial frog in the pot. The water's coming to a boil. We better not think it's cozy. We better not think it's relaxing. We better not think it's a hot tub. I'm here to tell you, my friends, the sky is falling. The wolf of debt and bankruptcy really is at the door. We simply have to win this election. The reality is this. In my bones, I know we are blessed to live in the greatest country in the history of the world. I know our best days are ahead of us, not behind us. I know we'll leave more opportunities to our children than we inherited from our parents, but to preserve that American dream, let's do everything we can to elect Mitt Romney as our next president and make sure that Barack Obama is a one-term president. He comes back to this great city of Chicago. God bless y'all. Thank y'all very much.